I've done a lot of thinking on the drive. Here you go. And I'm absolutely certain the main reason I've never been more popular is because of my temper. You must be so mad at me. The truth now.
Well, who doesn't let off a little steam every once in a while?
So Stephen King, despite being probably the most famous author of the past few decades and having many of his best-selling works turned into numerous film and television adaptations, still has a bit of a patchy history when it comes to movie versions of his work. For every Carrie, there's a Dreamcatcher, and for every Stand By Me, there's a Sleepwalkers, which is such a bad film. Thankfully, 1990's big screen production of his 1987 novel Misery falls into the side of great adaptations. Guys, I'm Stephen at Real Classic Film Reviews, and although Misery might not immediately seem like it belongs in a bracket of classic films, it's crazy to think that it's already 30 years old. So as a brief disclaimer, I have not read the novel of Misery, and I have very little knowledge of anything that may or may not have been carried over into this film, so go easy on me. Actually, that puts me in pretty good stead to talk about this film as its own entity without it becoming a comparison video. So Misery is often classified as an out-and-out horror film, but in actual fact it's probably more of a psychological thriller, and I suppose sometimes there's not a great deal of difference. But here, with the exception of a batshit crazy climax and a brief but memorable scene midway through, which we'll come across in a few minutes, there's very little of the violence and gore that the previous decade's horror movies had been full of. So Misery was directed by Rob Reiner, who's never been one of my favourite filmmakers, to be really honest. But he had already knocked out a brilliant King adaptation with his 1986 film Stand By Me, which is a personal favourite of mine. So Misery tells the story of writer Paul Sheldon, played here by James Caan. Sheldon is the author of the world-famous series of romance books starring the title character Misery Chastain. After finally completing his latest and hopefully final Misery entry, he gathers the manuscript and sets off on an ill-fated car journey through a surprise snowstorm. And it's not long before this happens. So afterwards, Paul wakes to find himself in the care of Annie Wilkes, played here by Kathy Bates, who's a bit conveniently a former nurse and a superfan of Paul's novels, who's obsessed with his Misery series. Due to the blizzard, the road to the hospital is now closed, apparently, and she starts nursing him while he recovers from the accident, which has left him with 2 broken legs and a dislocated shoulder.
Your shoulder was pretty badly dislocated. It was a little stubborn, but I finally popped it back in. What I'm most proud of is the work I did on those legs. Considering what I had around the house, I don't think there's a doctor who could have done any better.
And you know, thank goodness for Kathy Bates. She's so nice and she's so caring, and she definitely has Paul's health and his recovery at heart. And
what do you think I say when I go to the feed store in town? Oh, now, Wally, give me a bag of that effing pig feed and 10 pounds that bitchly cow corn. And in the bank, do I tell Mrs. Bollinger, oh, here's one big bastard of a check. Give me some of your Christing money. There, look there. See what you made me do?
Crikey. Well, it soon becomes apparent that Annie is quite disturbed, to say the least, and Paul comes to the realisation that he's actually in captivity rather than care.
And don't even think about anybody coming for you. Not the doctors, not your agent, not your family, because I never called them.
So it's not long before things go from bad to absolutely nuts when Annie reads his latest finished manuscript and is absolutely outraged to discover that her hero has ended the romance series and killed off her beloved main character.
And you murdered her!
No, I didn't.
Who did?
No one. She died. She just slipped away.
Slipped away? Slipped away?
She then proceeds to force Paul into writing a brand new Misery book to fix things and have her beloved series continue. And seeing as he's crippled and in no fit state to do a runner, he doesn't really have a choice. He's absolutely at Annie's mercy until he can eventually escape or be rescued. This is a relatively small and contained film, which obviously adds to Caan's helplessness, with the majority of the movie taking place either in Annie's home or with the odd visit outside to follow the small town authorities, which basically amounts to the local sheriff and his wife, played here by an excellent Richard Farnsworth and Frances Sternhagen. These two are so good in this film that I would have watched an entire film of the pair just bickering at each other.
I figured that if I can't find Paul Sheldon, at least I can find out what he wrote about.
What do you expect to find? A story about a guy who drove his car off a cliff in a snowstorm?
You see, it's just that kind of sarcasm that's given our marriage real spice.
Screen icon Lauren Bacall even gets a minor role as Paul's agent, bookending the film, but outside of that, the cast is relatively small. With all due respect to James Caan, this is the Kathy Bates show, and Bates carries the whole film with basically the performance of her career. It's a turn that earned her the Best Actress Oscar, the first awarded to a leading actress in a horror movie. On the night, beating acting titans Meryl Streep, Julia Roberts and Angelica Houston to the prize. Seemingly effortlessly switching between caring sensitivity on the outside with her inner rage and 0 to 100 violent nature, Bates created one of cinema's most memorable villains, managing to evoke absolute dread and fear with just a touch of sympathy. James Caan, though, obviously outshone by Bates to an extent, gives a convincing performance. You genuinely wince at his pain as he crawls and falls around the house. And his interactions with Bates are realistic to the point of becoming upsetting. And in all honesty, it's the performances of Bates and Caan here that make sure the film rises above being a slightly above average thriller. I love the fact that the cat and mouse game between, obsessed fan and crippled horror author still had me on the edge of my seat after multiple viewings of this film. Caan managing to escape his room after his captor pops into town with varying degrees of success.
You crazy bitch.
Which all obviously ends him up in a spot of bother, which brings us to a scene in the film that has passed into movie legend and in fact already had long before I even watched the film as a younger dude. I remember being at school and people referencing a procedure known as hobbling.
Annie, for God's,
Shh, darling. Trust me.
God's sake.
It's for the best.
Annie, please!
I won't spoil that scene for you here, but you really need to see it for yourself. When most films today prefer exaggerated loud sound effects and gallons of blood and guts to get the job done, here in this film the horror's almost matter of fact, and the cruelty and pain of this sequence is still the stuff of nightmares. For me personally, it absolutely haunted me as one of the scariest sequences ever recorded.
God, I love you.
Avoiding spoilers of the film's finale, it's safe to say that Annie finally gets her just desserts as the movie descends into actual zany horror movie madness. Bates would go on to star in a couple more Stephen King films, in 94's miniseries The Stand and taking the title role in 95's Dolores Claiborne. So author Stephen King himself ranks Misery in his top 10 movie adaptations, and also audiences of the time agreed, with the film making back triple its budget. Even after 3 decades, King's story of obsession, isolation and torture still managed to get your skin crawling. It's a nice example that outrageous special effects and buckets of blood can't compete with great actors and a tension-filled story. Go check it out.